everybody for coming this morning and participating in this event. We are very, very happy to have Dr. Ghosh participate in his presentation on anatomy of a hack. Dr. Ghosh has a very distinguished career as the CEO and the founder of Invincia, a cybersecurity firm, one of the leading firms in the area. He has a long list of accolades. To name just a few, he's been recognized as the top 5 most admired CEO in technology by the Washington Business Journal, a top 20 defense tech solution provider by CIO Review, most innovative company of the year by the RSA Conference, a medal for exceptional public service by the Secretary of Defense. He has published more than 40 peer-reviewed articles in cybersecurity journals. Prior to founding Invincia, he was a program manager at DARPA, where he created and managed an extensive portfolio of cybersecurity programs. He has also held roles as chief scientist in the Center for Secure Information Systems at George Mason University. He has served as vice president of research at Cigital, Inc., and he serves on numerous boards. His PhD is from the University of Virginia. Please welcome Dr. Ghosh.
And taking time away from your day to hopefully learn about cybersecurity. The introduction I was asked to talk about is, how does a data breach actually happen? So as I understand it, you guys are in the enforcement business. So when a data breach happens for carriers, you investigate and possibly levy some sanctions. And what David had asked me to do is tell us, without getting too technical, how do these breaches actually happen? And I actually think you came up with the title, so we'll go with it, Anatomy of a Data Breach. And I'd like to make this presentation very interactive, meaning if you have questions, just go ahead, raise your hand, or just go ahead and shout and ask. I know it's always more intimidating to ask a question, but believe me, it keeps it more interesting for me. And I'm glad to make it interactive. I look at the slides as a placeholder for a conversation. So anytime there's something that interests you, just go ahead and speak up. A little bit about Invincia. I appreciate the kind introduction. So we are in the advanced threat protection space as opposed to conventional defenses, right? So when you think about sophisticated adversaries and targeted attacks, that's the space that Invincia plays in. We're probably best known for a strategic OEM with Dell. So today, Dell ships Invincia in all of their commercial endpoints. We originally came out of DARPA-funded research. So the technologies that we developed under DARPA funding, we've brought to market. And that's partially why we're able to be out in front of where everyone else is in the technology side. So let's talk about data breach. Obviously, we are all familiar with the OPM data breach, and I'm sure everyone here is impacted by it, and I am as well. And I'm sure you're angry, I know I am, that OPM lost our entire life history, right? And whether it was a sophisticated adversary or not, that's data about our own lives and families that we entrust to federal agencies to keep safe. Right, and in this case, they weren't able to do that. And obviously, it's not just the federal government; it's all these commercial firms. These are all brand names. This is all within the last year, and it's not a complete list. There's a great, and obviously, I'm not intending for you to read this chart, but there's a great data visualization of data breaches organized. It's a timeline at the bottom. And it's also a bubble chart based on the number of records that are breached. So if you can see the URL, it's pretty neat to take a look at this if you want to learn more about data breaches and how extensive they've been. The bottom line I come away with on data breaches is that all of our data has been breached multiple times. And it's gotten so bad in terms of data breach that your records, your credit history, now your personal life history, and maybe soon your medical records will all have been breached probably multiple times. depending on where they exist and who's had it. So I'm sure many of you belong to Blue Cross Blue Shield, and you saw that they got breached as well. I've received so many breach notices; it's crazy. But this, if you check out this chart, you'll see there's the number of records that have been breached is phenomenal. So a little game here, a little game by numbers. So a minute 22. Any idea what that represents? Anyone just take a random guess? I know it's just like a crazy question. That's how long it takes for someone to click on a malicious link off of a spearfish. A minute 22. So if I'm an adversary, the way I'll get into your network, and we'll get a little more into this, is I'm going to send a spearfish, and I won't send it to one person, I'll send it to many people in your organization. A minute 22 is the time it takes for my first click to happen. So if you want to talk about how long does it take to get onto someone's network, that's it. 77%, that's the percentage of organizations that feel like they're getting breached through their web browser. 1 to 3% is the estimate of the number of machines on your enterprise network today that are already compromised, that you don't know about. 1 to 3% of your machines already compromised. 205 days, and this is probably the scariest metric of them all. 205 days, I'm willing to bet someone knows that one. Anyone? Go ahead. Ding, 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 you got it. So 205 days is the time the adversary is on your network before you discover that adversary, right? And by the way, most of the time it's not you doing the discovering, it's a third party doing the discovering. It's the FBI, it's a customer, it's someone else that's informing you, oh, by the way, you've been compromised. Brian Krebs. Okay, so this is one of the more important slides, simply because it really walks you through how does an adversary get onto a network. So again, you guys are responsible for other companies that are in your space, and if you want to understand how does data breach happen, now we all understand data stored typically on servers, right? So you talk about millions and millions of records. Those aren't on people's individual PCs, not normally, right? They're stored in data storage farms, typically, right? So you would assume that the way to get to the data is to go attack these data storage farms, right? It could be the cloud, it could be, a private cloud, it could be a data farm in a building. It turns out that's the hard way of doing it, is to try to go attack that data farm. The easy way, and the way it almost always works, is you in fact target the organization itself. More importantly, you target the people in the organization. And so this is an adaptation of what's called the cyber kill chain. Kill chain is a Department of Defense concept. The idea behind a kill chain is it takes an adversary several stages to get to their objective. Let's say their objective is data breach, right? It takes them several stages to get there. And the idea is if you can stop the adversary anywhere in their tracks before they get to the data, which is stage 8, well, you've broken the chain, right? And what's helpful for learning about cyber threats is this is how they work, almost always. Not exclusively, but almost always. And it always starts out with intelligence or reconnaissance. Let me scope out my target. Let me learn about my target. Well, how do you do that? Probably the best way is LinkedIn, right? So if I go on LinkedIn now and I type in FCC, I'm going to see a lot of profiles of a lot of people. And I'm going to learn a lot about you. And I might even send you a LinkedIn message and we might connect, right? And this normal behavior is usually acceptable. There's also Facebook, of course, there's Google, all kinds of ways of learning about the people in the organization. At that point, I'm going to put together a campaign, right? A campaign says, I'm going to devote time and resources to getting onto your network, How do I do that? Well, it's, unlike the movies, it's actually incredibly easy to do this, right? So the way it works is I send an email, and the email will have either a link or it'll have an attachment. Either one will do. But what the link will do is if you click on that link, it'll actually direct your browser to a site that will then download malicious code unbeknownst to you. Now, this email, it could actually be a LinkedIn invite. And oftentimes what we'll see is it's a LinkedIn invite from someone that you were more than likely to accept. So, for example, let's say you're not linked in with the commissioner of the FCC, and you got a LinkedIn invite from the commissioner. Now, maybe that's very unusual. He wouldn't do that, and so you might suspect it, but maybe it's not, right? And you go ahead and accept that LinkedIn invite. Well, that accept, that button when you hit accept, that could be rigged. That could be rigged to point to a site that is not LinkedIn, right? It's actually a site that looks like LinkedIn, but it's going to download malicious code. Now, how hard is this? It's not very hard at all to put together this email. And the other question is, can we train away the human behavior of clicking on that link? And the answer is no. Now, many people have tried. There are all kinds of training programs. There's even firms. There's a whole segment of companies who will come in and do training. And they will try to teach all of you to distinguish between good emails and bad emails and teach you not to click on bad emails. And there are some who believe that you should be punished if you do click on a bad email because we obviously trained you not to do that. Now, the reality is that none of it works, that you can train. But, the only way it works is if everybody makes the right decision every time an email comes in. It's just never going to happen. So, in fact, Verizon Business did a study, and their study asked the question, how many emails does it take to guarantee someone will click on it? And the answer was at 16 emails, I'm guaranteed someone in an organization will click on it. 100% guaranteed. So it always works, and that's why it's always used. Now, I said it could also be an attachment. An attachment could be PowerPoint. It could be Word. Word's really popular now for hosting malicious code. But there's even really clever ways of doing this. I'll share with you one. Because you might still be skeptical that you're too smart to click on a spearfish. Well, let me give you an example. So let's say you're a hiring manager, right? You have a job rec, and you're hiring for a junior analyst position. So you go to HR and you say, hey, here's my job description. I want you to post this. And they post it to Career Builder. Now, this is a real story. I'm not making this up. They post it to Career Builder. So on Career Builder, which is a job site, you'll have FCC junior analyst. Go ahead and send in your resumes. Now, if I'm an adversary, in my recon, I'll have looked at FCC, and I'll see, oh, there's a job posting. Great. So what they will do is they will go and send a resume, which might be a PDF, it might be a Word doc, in response to that job ad. Okay? It doesn't go to FCC. It goes to Career Builder. Career Builder then sends an email to you, the hiring manager. So you've got a resume for this job that you posted. And it comes from Career Builder. It doesn't come from your adversary. And it comes with an attachment. The attachment's a PDF. Now, you're a hiring manager. It's your job to actually review resumes. In fact, if you don't, you're actually liable, right? So what do? You double-click on that PDF, and guess what? Bad things just happened. Silently. They didn't tell you it was bad. You don't see a blue screen anymore. Bad things happen. You do see a resume, so you're kind of none the wiser, right? And that is how it always works. You always win when you're an adversary in this scenario. So that's attack delivery, which is an email. Stage 3 is the exploit. Sir?
Yeah, one thing I kind of tearing my hair out because we got some information.
There's a microphone that goes around so that you can be captured for all time.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, so when we were sent information about the OPM data breach just recently, they sent it as a Word document.
Yes.
And it was just text, So I kind of why do I need to open a Word document to just read, it should have been just plain text about this OPM data breach.
Sure.
So it seems like part of the problem is a lot of times people use more risky ways of communicating than just, and the very simple stuff of sort of plain text of even the idea of, writing everything so it's like public information. So, it's not so much the issue of somebody stealing it because, there's nothing to steal if you kind of have the idea that you respond to data breaches by working out more in the open than trying to work harder to prevent people from getting your stuff. When, like you say, it's very, very hard even to stop people from getting your stuff. So I kind of wonder, those are the more kind of simple approaches to cybersecurity, like don't use complicated formats and don't have secrets. How do you assess the trade-off between those simple stuff versus more complicated security technologies?
Well, let's go back to the letter. So it's very unusual to get notification via email with a Word attachment. That's very unusual. Typically, you'll get a letter in the mail, and it'll be something that you open with a letter opener, right? You pull out a piece of paper. That's your typical notification, or it'll be on a website. So it is a bit unusual that they sent not only an email, but also an attachment, because clearly that could be spoofed, that could be a spearfish, right? And that's not unprecedented in the sense that there was a pretty funny, at least I thought there's an element of humor on the adversary on this one. So there was a well-disclosed campaign, Symantec had disclosed this campaign about a Chinese adversary who had targeted oil and gas and chemical companies. And Symantec put out a report, a PDF of a report, talking about that attack campaign. And sure enough, not long after, the same adversary took that same report, PDF, laced it with malware, and distributed that report, put it on websites and that sort of thing. So the very people who were trying to learn about this attack were then getting compromised by the report that had been laced. So it's not unprecedented for an adversary to take advantage of news of the breach to then go and get more people. As to your second question, simplicity versus more complexity, right? There is a role for cyber hygiene, as it's called. Unfortunately, I think we get stuck there, right? So if you looked at the cyber sprint that the White House announced, right? The 30-day cyber sprint. Hey, everyone, brush your teeth, please. Floss, right? Do a little exercise, we'll be fine. And the reality is it's actually not that simple. So it's very hard to patch, and a lot of folks don't get this. If you could just patch, wouldn't we stop most of these exploits? Well, yeah, a lot of them would. The problem is you just can't patch. So anyone raise their hand, what version of Internet Explorer are they using? Yeah, you're shaking your head like, no, let's not go there, right? What version of Java are you using, right? You probably have some Windows XP machines. No one raised their hand, right? But the point is, if it was that easy to patch, it would be happening. It's not incompetence. It's actually the systems that we use are not backwards compatible typically. So we're stuck on legacy software that we can't patch. As a result, the adversary knows this, so they exploit all the time, right? So we'd love to say it was as easy as brushing your teeth, but it's not. Let me keep going. So stage 4 is after they get that point of presence on your machine, they phone home. And they say, hey, I'm here. I'm on a network called fcc.gov. I don't know. And give me more instructions. And oftentimes they sit quiescent at that point, meaning they sit silent, nothing's going on, until the time of choosing of the adversary, when they say, wake up, and we're going to go do some exploring. So the exploring is the internal recon. And this is what's called lateral movement. in a network. And this is when you're scoping out the network, because oftentimes the initial breach is not your target. It's a beachhead onto the network. It is a place from which you move to find what you're looking for. Okay. Now, again, in the context of carriers, right, this might be an employee at a major telco who is just the initial point of entry. But once you're there, almost all security falls down, because now you're running with the privilege of that employee. That means all of their rights and privileges you now have. So you're not an outsider, you're not an adversary, you're a Joe, and you're running with Joe's privileges. And I can now see everything Joe can see, which includes a cloud, includes servers, and includes the rest of the network, right? So they're moving laterally. They begin to colonize the network, because if Joe's machine gets wiped, I want to be able to live. So they start getting other machines. They start remotely logging into other machines. They grab passwords from what's called an AD controller, and now they're beginning to colonize the network. Stage 7 is establishing persistence, and that's exactly by colonizing the network, I can now create my own internal network where I have machines communicating with each other in order to grab data, stage it, and then begin to exfiltrate it. And that's stage 8, right? And this is where the breach happens. Go ahead.
So I wonder, those antivirus and Symantec is useless here or not?
So great question. So is Symantec antivirus useless? Antivirus is not useless if the attack they're using is known to antivirus. Now the problem is, if it's a targeted attack, meaning I'm going after AT&T or Verizon or FCC, I'm not going to use a known attack. So in that case, any signature-based defense like an antivirus will not see it. Okay, and that's why these breaches happen, because what you're running on your endpoint is signature-based technology, which means it has to know the attack ahead of time in order to defend against it. And that paradigm is broken long ago, but we're still running that same tech. That's why you're reading about these breaches. Just a little point on terminology. We call stage 3, when the breach happens, we call that a compromise. Okay, that means that machine is now compromised. Someone else took control and owns it. Stage 8, which is when the data is lost, it's called exfiltration. That's called data breach, right? So the idea, if you're in security, you may not believe you can stop stage 3. I believe you can, but you may not believe you can. But certainly you have opportunity all along the way before they get to stage 8. Because at the end of the day, if you're responsible for data, you want to stop them before stage 8. Because if you don't stop them before stage 8, you're now in stage 9. You don't want to be in stage 9. Stage 9 is where the FBI comes in and they tell you, you lost 4 million records of all federal employees. And the Senate calls you to testify. And then it comes out that it was actually 18 million records. And then it's 31 million records. And it's embarrassing. And you're a head of an agency. You don't know anything about this stuff. That's really bad. You don't want to get to stage 9. So you want to stop them before stage 8, right? Go ahead.
I have heard that in the case of the OPM hack, that they actually used a federal contractor's credentials to get into the system. So in that event, what kind of precautions can you take against that?
What kind of
precautions can be taken against an individual either offering up or being forced to give his credentials where he has access to a system?
So, and by the way, we don't know if that's the case, but let's assume it is, right? The same case was made for Target, right? With Target, what they said was it wasn't us, it was them, right? And in this case, them was a contractor, sounds similar, right, who got onto our network. Well, look, if it's a contractor, don't let them on your network, right? Why should an HVAC contractor be on the same network as a point-of-sale terminal? It's really poor network design, if you think about it. In the case of a federal contractor, if you can't vouch for the integrity of that machine before they get on your network, you shouldn't let them on your network, right? They shouldn't be on the network where they can access other machines that have your data, for instance. So it works the same way, by the way. The attacks work the same way. So what you would want are your contractors to be able to stop the attack at stage 3, right? The attack at stage 3 is a compromise. So if that contractor got compromised, they now take that machine, put it on your network, right? Well, that recon stage now happens on your network, and now they're moving lateral on your network. So, you have to treat everyone coming onto your network as a potential infection.
Dr. Ghosh.
Yeah, a great example of that within our regulatory space, although in another country, was the TV Monde attack, where they are systems that actually manipulated the control head for the distribution of their channels, of their television product.
Oh, wow.
Was on the same network as their back office business and the same network as their email systems. So that design criteria that you described, where you've really got to begin to think about these things at the start of how you architect networks, is so important to, I think, our jobs. And as we look at data breaches that would occur within the telecommunications space and other kinds of malicious effects, we increasingly need, I believe, to expect a standard of care, if you will, in how communications companies architect for their networks. And if they make those kind of rookie mistakes, we need to call them on it and ensure that they have the expectation that we will call them on it if they're not appropriately segregating critical functions of their networks.
And that's key. And I'm not going to spend time in how would you design, right? But you don't see a whole lot of that in enterprise networks. And the reason why you don't see a lot of what we're talking about is a core design model of segregation of interest, right? So in this case, you have a guest network that should be separate from your enterprise network, right? You might segregate finance from IT, right? As an example, software development from HR. These are examples of different groups where you can do enforcement of segregation between these networks. That not a lot of folks are doing that. And the reason why they're not is because they assume the perimeter is at the firewall. And you keep the bad guys out that way rather than assuming that a compromise has occurred inside your network and trying to move laterally. So,
yes, that concept of compartmentalization, whether it's possible, was actually my question. Is it the case that it just comes down to cost and benefit?
No,
and
it's not a cost issue.
I mean, it seems the costs of a breach at the perimeter are pretty high at this point. And
Yes.
are people focusing more on compartmentalizing the release of information internally within networks, as you described?
They're not really focused on it. They need to be. Again, it's more a lack of a design in security. That's the problem here. So compartmentalization, containerization, these are core concepts in security that you can do at a network level. You can also do it on a machine level. In fact, that's exactly what Invincia does. We do compartmentalization on a machine itself to stop bad content you might download from accessing data in the rest of the network, right? It's a core design concept that people haven't quite adopted yet. Okay. Any other questions on? Go ahead. Up here. Hold on.
I wondered that the network intrusion detection should be able to detect something at stage 5 and also at stage 8, because when they do recon, network intrusion detection should be able to flag something going on here. And number 8 is when the data is leaked out with about like, you're talking about a lot of record, 18 million, there should be a massive amount of data being transferred out of the organization, then there should be something flagged right there. So why couldn't that happen and to prevent, to make the detection appear more quicker?
Great question. We don't know why it didn't happen. I can tell you that at stage 5, most network intrusion detection systems are blind. Okay? And the reason why they're blind is they're looking at ingress and egress to the network itself, again, at the perimeter. So network intrusion detection systems are watching what comes in. A lot of them aren't watching what goes out. Some of them do, right? To your point, if you're exfilling, gigabytes or terabytes of records to some place, there should be a detection on that. They're not looking, is what it comes down to. They're not looking.
At the stage 5, it should be at level of PC, so the antivirus, what is the endpoint detection should have the network security there should flag that right at the PC level already.
Most of them are not. Most of them are not. They're not looking at lateral movement inside of an organization. So I haven't seen it. Again, the model in security today is a castle and moat model. You've got a perimeter, and you've got the bad guys on the outside and the good guys on the inside. And there's not a presumption that someone's already bad on the inside. So they're not looking inside the network, by and large. Okay. I'll keep chugging along here. Let's talk a little bit about how things have changed on the adversarial side. A lot of questions I know typically. So you can think of on the x-axis here, you can mass target large groups versus pinpoint targeting, and the so-called script kiddies typically are doing mass targeting. As you go in higher in sophistication, you get more towards pinpoint targeting. When you talk about nation states, they're typically not interested in heisting large amounts of fraud data. Right now, they're heisting large amounts of employee data, for instance. But even then, it's pinpoint targeting of an organization. Right? So what we've seen is this sort of threat curve back in the 2010 era of this is the amount of effort required to get to pinpointed targeting, where only the very elite teams had the capabilities to go do targeted attacks. Now things have changed since then, and some of these changes have been toolkitted. And what a toolkit allows an adversary to do is do very pinpoint targeted attacks inside of a user interface that you can click with a mouse, right? So for example, you can test your exploit with guarantees that it won't be detected by an antivirus solution before you send it.
I'm sorry, can you tell us what the script and the Lone Wolf apps, can you go back?
Yeah.
Can you just walk us through what?
Sure. So script kiddies, think of the hacker movies where you have the kids, the 14-year-old kids. Some of you might remember back in the 1998-99 timeframe, famously, a Deputy Secretary of Defense said we've experienced the most sophisticated attack ever against the Department of Defense. It turned out to be 2 14-year-old boys from California. That was embarrassing. Those were script kiddies, right? They were somewhat being directed, but they were script kiddies. Lone wolves, these are people who have an agenda, but it's not a political ideology necessarily, not an organization. Hacktivists, we've seen a lot of that, right? So these are groups with a political agenda, right? And Anonymous is a well-known one, but there are several of them out there. What they will do is they will target organizations because they disagree with them politically, typically. And by the way, their attacks are not very sophisticated, typically, because these are politically motivated people more than they're technical experts. But they will join denial of service attacks to bring them down. Organized crime, this is a huge business. In fact, I would probably say about 98% of all attacks are in the organized crime category, simply because they're after monetary realization for their efforts. And it's a huge business, very, very large business. And nation states, of course, we all know about China, Russia, and others that are doing targeted attacks against U.S. firms and U.S. government. So some of these toolkits now allow you to do very sophisticated evasions of network defenses. So, for example, you can click these boxes and say, hey, use encryption to foil analysis of data on networks. Go ahead and detect if you're being analyzed in a VM. These very, very much click box oriented. And so this threat curve that was circa 2010 is now being bent up, pulled up here, where you can get fairly high sophisticated attacks with a lower level of capability, right? So organized crime, maybe even hacktivists now have been pulled up into this. Kids are going to be able to use very sophisticated attacks because it's been toolkitted. These toolkits are available for a few $100s, right? And I can go ahead and purchase one and launch very sophisticated attacks that'll bypass most of the defenses that are out there. Any questions on the adversarial side and how they work? No? Over here.
I saw Alex Stamos' internet presentation on cybersecurity, which was really frightening. And one thing he mentioned is that in China, they have sort of these offices where they have big racks of kind of commercial off-the-shelf cybersecurity equipment. And his sort of view was any commercial off-the-shelf cybersecurity equipment is going to be compromised because you've got a lot of brain power who can just kind of buy the equipment and analyze it for vulnerabilities. And so kind of my sense out of that was he was saying that, cybersecurity is going to have to move towards custom solutions, custom non-commercial solutions so that you're not vulnerable to these other people. And if you think about that, it's huge for the internet because it implies a great concentration in the way security is going to be done, so that if you're just starting a little company and you got to rely on off-the-shelf stuff. Mm-hmm. And so sure. If you're relying on off-the-shelf stuff, then you either got to have to somehow contract out your cybersecurity or not have cybersecurity. So I kind of wonder at that large, high-level industry structure perspective, do you think it's true that if there's commercial off-the-shelf stuff, there's always going to be adversaries who have figured out and shared ways to compromise it, so that the only kind of path forward on cybersecurity is building custom systems and then somehow figuring out how to manage that so you don't have custom systems are a pain and it's kind of like the anti-internet, anti everything.
So I don't think it's true, and it's certainly not scalable. Most organizations don't have the capabilities to monitor their own networks, let alone design their own security protocols and devices. So it's not a scalable approach. I get Alex is in a fairly unique position. He was at Yahoo, now he's at Facebook. He's got a team of hundreds of people that can try to build tools. Would they be better than the best commercial off-the-shelf? I highly doubt that. And the reality, too, is we think of these things as boxes, these devices. But, in fact, many of them are learning, right? And so they're using cloud-based analytics to detect anomalies that are going on in the networks. So it's not something that's necessarily, sure, if it's signature-based, you can absolutely test it just like that one interface showed, right? And you can get assured results. But if it's something that's learning and is based on the current state of knowledge of the internet, it's not really going to buy you a whole lot. So I think it's always a perspective. You take every perspective into account. I get his perspective, but it's not a scalable approach beyond the very largest companies in the world.
Thinking about the points of weakness, sort of the chain that you were describing, it occurs to me that you've described another point of weakness, and that is these toolkits that are online.
Mm-hmm.
Forgive my ignorance, but are you aware of any focus of law enforcement on the actual marketing of those toolkits?
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, there's, in fact, there was a recent Justice Department case where a spyware company was indicted. And it's interesting because there's a market for spyware, it turns out, right? People like to spy on spouses and others. And so there's a legitimate market for these things. And then there's an illegitimate market, which are kind of what we're seeing here. So they successfully indicted someone in that space. They understand that these are software tools. There's export restrictions now around these tools. So that's one angle. One angle is to begin to prosecute people behind these tools. But it gets to gray areas, right? At the end of the day, it's technology, right? To make the analogy to guns, right? Guns don't kill people, people kill people. I'm not making a political statement, but the point there is this is technology. How it's used matters, right? So if it's used in nefarious and illegal ways, then there's an actor that's behind that. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the way the adversary gets onto the network. If you look at, this is from 2013. The numbers haven't changed a whole lot, but these are the applications that get exploited. And if you look at a Microsoft Internet Explorer, is in terms of number of vulnerabilities, we're at the top. In terms of number of high vulnerabilities, was at the very top. And then you go down Java, Chrome, Firefox, and so on and so forth, all the way down to Adobe Acrobat Reader and Flash Player. And what you can see is, if you look at number of high vulnerabilities, these are very, very significant. This has actually gotten worse, to be honest, in 2015. So this is your attack surface, it turns out. These are the applications that are getting exploited that then lead to the adversary living on your network. And that's what's leading us to the fact that network sandboxing, which was the next generation of security, is now being largely bypassed by these same adversaries, right? And it's being bypassed because the exploits are they're not necessarily executables. They're not programs that are being sent down. It's actual exploit code that bypasses network sandboxes. And now they're running largely unimpeded on these networks. It's relatively easy to bypass. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples of how you bypass these technologies. So malvertising. Anyone familiar with malvertising? No? So advertising. It's really a fascinating space because it changes our whole viewpoint of how you defend networks. I always say that you get these big jumps in security exploits that change the way we think of security. And this is one of these examples. Advertising, of course, the internet runs by advertising, right? And advertising is very targeted, right? In other words, when you go to CNN.com, there's a bunch of ads that are rendered based on their knowledge of you at that point in time, right? There's whole toolkits that are designed to allow advertisers to target specific people based on their demographics, right? So obviously whenever you go to Amazon, you'll notice things kind of show up the way you want them to. Oh, I really am looking at this garden thing or this dress or what have you, right? So those same capabilities to do demographic targeting are now being used by adversaries to target companies. Okay? And so what they're not doing is they're not compromising websites. They're actually using the advertising built into websites to drop malware. Now here's the really scary part. It doesn't require any clicks. So when you visit, and I'll show you a list of websites that'll blow your mind. When you visit some of these sites without doing anything at all, sometimes you'll have malware drop on your machine, unbeknownst to you. Now, we uncovered a campaign, and this is, by the way, so these are examples. It's called real-time ad bidding, and these are the types of parameters that you can bid on, right? I can bid on gender-specific ads. I can bid on specific zip codes, regions, cities. I can even bid on IP address ranges. So if I know your company IP address, which is knowable, I can actually target anyone coming from this IP address range. I'm going to display this ad. Now here's what happens when that ad displays. It might actually be an LL Bean ad, just so you know. It's not going to be, this is a malicious ad. It won't tell you that. It might be an LL Bean ad. At the time of their choosing, when this ad is displayed, and by the way, it's bid. So they say, hey, if you get a match for my parameter that I'm targeting, I'll pay 3 cents for that ad to be displayed at that moment. That's literally like the price range. Okay, and then when that ad displays, it makes a connection to a back-end server, and they can flip a switch, and that back-end server can now run a malicious script. Okay, so unbeknownst to the user. And so we uncovered a campaign. We dramatically called it Operation Death Click, and they were using this advertising capability to target defense firms. And some of the ads were things like laser radar, right? And they would drop, for very specific defense firms, they would drop malware through the advertising on sites. These were some of the sites. They were dropping on Dawn.com, SiteCentral.com, FleaFlicker.com. And basically, we don't have to get into all the technical details. What we found was you couldn't block these ads. If you were manning those networks, if you were defending those networks, you couldn't stop it, right? You would have to blacklist a bunch of major sites. Now, we uncovered a larger campaign that was less targeted. That was targeted against specific defense companies, U.S. defense companies. This was part of we call this campaign Festleak. It was named after a Russian actor who goes by Festleak. And these were the sites, you can see them here, that he was dropping ads from. This is actually a little bit dated because he still continues. Who hasn't been to dictionary.com, right? Look at some of these sites. Huffington Post, Time Warner, Realtor.com. Oh, by the way, Zillow.com, Kayak.com, right? Basically, the major traffic sites, this one actor was dropping malware. And not only was it malware, some of these were called 0 days. 0 days are previously unknown vulnerabilities in Adobe, in this case, Adobe Flash. Question in the back.
Were these websites not doing anything to detect malware in the advertising uploaded to them?
Largely, they're blind. And here's why. Because the ad that's rendered, they don't know what ad is rendered, right? The ad that is rendered depends on you, right? These are all syndicated ad spaces on their network. They don't even know.
Just a conduit.
Yes, yeah, they're largely blind. These were all the ones that we discovered, right? So the list is much longer of actual websites. So we discovered. So we ship on every Dell commercial laptop. So we've got a pretty large user base across the globe, and we see these exploits happening every single day. CBSSports.com. This was during the NCAA's. CBSSports.com was dropping malware, unbeknownst to people, right? And we would let them know. Oh, by the way, but the person we were telling didn't even know what to do with that information. Didn't even know what to do with the information. What do I do with that? They don't know. Question.
So I have a question. Most of these ads are served up by very large ad networks. From a regulatory standpoint, do you think that we should impose regulation on the ad networks to better police the ads that they are serving? In other words, if you're an ad network and you're serving malvertising, then you should be responsible for that, or where should the responsibility lie?
Yes, and I'm not a regulatory person. Yes, absolutely, and I'll tell you why.
forget the regulatory part. What player in the ecosystem would be best suited to detect a malvertising attack?
The ad networks. So let me tell you how it works since you asked, right? So you're right. Very large ad networks are at play here, right? Google and others, right? They, in turn, have excess inventory, right, that they sell. When they sell the excess inventory, they're selling them to other ad networks, right, third-party ad networks. Those third-party ad networks are smaller firms. You wouldn't know them by name. And they, in turn, will sell their ads to anyone who will place an ad. There's no vetting that goes on, right? This is where most of the malicious ads are coming from, okay? It's incredibly hard to stop, but they are the conduit. No one is being responsible here, and the victims are everyone. So we see, by the way, I don't know if I have my slides, ransomware. Anyone know what ransomware is? Yes? So ransomware, if you know, I might have my slides, so I'll just leave it. We see a lot of ransomware being distributed through these types of ads. And unfortunately, this is one of these cases, and like I said, I'm not a regulatory guy. This is one of these cases where no one's going to take responsibility here. Absolutely no one. And these cyber crime guys are getting away with murder. So unless this is one of these cases, I think unless the federal government steps in and forces people to take responsibility, no one will.
So to follow up on that point, there are any number of smaller players in this that are the entry point, but aren't they being aggregated through the larger players such as Google, Yahoo, and the others? And wouldn't that be a choke point to look to?
I don't think they're aggregated in terms of selling. I don't think it's aggregated in terms of traffic, network traffic. So, and by the way, here's why it's even harder than you might think. So I can review the ad at the time it's purchased, right? And it'll be benign at that time. And so let's say you're a well-meaning advertiser, whether you're Google or a third-party smaller player, and you say, I'm going to scan every ad I sell, right? And to make sure I'm not distributing malware on this ad network. Fine, great. Well, the problem is the adversary gets to pick their time of choosing when they turn that ad into something malicious. So at the time they sell it, it might be benign. Later they can flip a switch and redirect where that ad points to a malicious server or change the server itself. So it's not an easy problem to solve, but it's very significant. There's a lot of malware being dropped from very huge sites. None of these sites know what to do about it.
Excuse me. So I understand this might not be a scalable solution, but would off-the-shelf products like NoScript or like Ghostery, would those be options for individuals to take to be able to block malvertising?
Yes. So if you install NoScript, right, it would stop certain types of attacks, right? The problem with NoScript is it tends to break the web. That's the problem, right? And most people don't know how to do that. You know how to do that, but not everyone knows how to do it, right? So incidentally, the reason why we know about this, the reason why we're breaking these stories is our customers running Invincia are running their browser in a container. So when bad stuff happens, it happens inside our container, we see it. So we protected those machines, right? So, my opinion is the real way to stop this is at the endpoint, but I got to protect every endpoint. I'm not a consumer company, so I'm not protecting consumers, right? So it's a pretty big problem. But you're right, there are also other ways of exploiting other than JavaScript and those sorts of ways, which make it harder.
So in the context of anatomy of a breach then, so does a adversary then use the Fessleak malvertising approach to get to employees at a company?
Yes.
So if you're targeting, let's say, one of the carrier companies, then you're dropping this ad on these random sites. Yes. And how does the individual know
all right, this is an employee at any of the carriers.
IP address range.
So then these are employees then who are operating from their work computers?
Yes.
I see.
Yes, and it's not hypothetical. We observe this in practice. Very specific defense firms were targeted. In fact, I've got even better example of this. Let's talk about ransomware for 1 second because people don't necessarily know about it. So ransomware, if you ever see a screen like this, I'm sorry. That's probably the best I can give you. This is really bad stuff. So ransomware, if you ever see it, means your machine has been taken over and they've encrypted your files. And they will now hold all of your files for a ransom. And it's not cheap. It's typically hundreds of dollars. And you have almost no choice at all. Your choices are to pay the ransom and get a key to decrypt your data. They stay behind, just so that you know that. They'll leave a back door in your machine. Or to not pay the ransom and your data is forever encrypted. So it's a tough place to be in unless you've done offline backups. It's a tough place to be in. Ransomware is exploding. It's exploding because of the amount of money being made on ransomware. If I tell you this, you might leave your job. The average ransomware campaigner makes between $35,000 and $50,000 a day. A day. Because of the amount of ransomware they're dropping and the conversion. You're leaving your job, I can tell. He's got that big smile. Because of the conversion rates on that. They're fairly significant. It's big business. It's being run out of Eastern Europe. And people, our entire lives are digital, right? It's all digital. So just think about everything, your work, your personal life, being encrypted. It's tragic. And it's exploding. Spreadsheets. So this is the example I was going to give you. So a watering hole attack is a type of attack that can use malvertising or not. But a watering hole, think of the African savanna, right? Watering hole is where animals go to feed, right? Because there's water, etc. It's also where the tigers go to feed on the animals that go to feed, right? So a watering hole is setting up a website that your target is likely to visit. So what would this website be? By the way, incidentally, your homepage is a great one. So if I want to get FCC, you guys probably visit fcc.gov. Historically, this is true. So if I compromise your website, that's another way of compromising your network because you're likely to visit your website. But there are many examples of this. One that was particularly interesting was Forbes.com. Who doesn't go to Forbes.com? Anyone? Everyone goes to Forbes.com, right? So this happened back in late November 2014, right around the Thanksgiving holiday. There was a watering hole attack that used Forbes.com. Forbes.com, one of the most heavily trafficked websites. This was really interesting because they use it as a watering hole, which is kind of weird. But the reason why it's weird is they could have grabbed 72 million visitors during that time period, but they didn't. They targeted very, very specific U.S. defense firms, very specific ones, because they were likely to visit Forbes.com. And they targeted it using IP address. And unfortunately, it wasn't a script. It wasn't malvertising. It actually was the thought of the day. You guys seen the thought of the day widget? It was that one. They rigged it. They rigged it with an exploit. And it wasn't just any exploit. It was a zero-day exploit, which meant Adobe. It was an Adobe Flash widget, it turns out. Adobe didn't know this vulnerability existed. But it wasn't just that. They actually used two chained zero days, one in Adobe Flash, another in Internet Explorer. And it required both. And Microsoft didn't know about this vulnerability either. So you couldn't have patched this. There was no defense against this attack. Okay? If you visited Forbes.com from one of these IP addresses that they had specified for these specific defense firms, they dropped malware. Turned out it was one of our customers that was targeted. So we saw it, and we blocked it and all that. And this is kind of how it worked. You don't need to know the technical details. But once it got on the network, once it got on the machine, it attempted to scan the network. And we saw it, we blocked it, we reported it. Microsoft asked us not to disclose it until they put a patch out. But this is an example of how these exploits work. What's my time?
We have time for a couple more questions.
Okay.
And then time to talk afterwards.
So I'll end it at that point. Did I get most of the... Go ahead.
Okay, so everything's a sieve, and IRS, everything else. Is there any guidance, any website we can go to protect our information? I mean, now, for example, in the federal information is out there. It's going to be out there for a long time.
Yes.
I mean, you can't do that. But what kinds of things can we do?
Your personal information you're talking about.
Yeah, as companies or individuals.
Yeah. So we're all in the same boat, just so you know. You've got good company. All of our data is lost, if that's any comfort. I hate to say it, it's like monitor your credit reports. Look, what may happen on the back of these breaches are spear phishing attacks. I get a lot, personally. I don't worry about them because I'm protected with my tech. But look at your emails and be careful. They've got your information. They're going to be they will send you spear phishing attacks. So that's one part. Monitor credit reports. Demand more of everyone. I think we all are becoming complacent to what's going on here. We accept what's going on here. The analogy I use, we all probably remember Windows 95 and Windows 98. We all, during that time period, because most of us, maybe not you, were old enough to work. And remember the blue screens of death? We all kind of accepted that. It was crazy. We'd do work, and all of a sudden the thing would crash. And we were like, hey, this is just Windows. And that was ridiculous, right? And Microsoft fixed itself. We don't have those anymore. These are solvable problems. We really just have to demand more of the software companies, of the hardware companies, of your own security firms to accept what's going on here is part of the problem. Question in the back.
Yeah, I want to go back to your stages because one of the things that you said was let's assume that there is an infection at stage 3. Somebody gets into a network by whatever means you described.
Right.
And then they go silent for some long period of time.
Sure.
Which sounds like that's a fairly typical strategy. And then typically what you said was the network detection, intrusion detection software that companies may have is blind to that. Correct? Is something being done to address that stage sort of before the attack occurs, that interval of time? Because that seems like that's time that's just working to the intruder's advantage. And so I guess my question is, from the perspective of those that are trying to build more dynamic cyber defenses, is there a way to use that time proactively to try to detect the presence of what is in essence a sleeper cell within the network before it wakes up?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to detect something that's quiescent in general, right? If it's not making any noise, then there's really nothing to observe. Also, candidly, it's not causing any harm either. So, the way we look at it is, see this box that's red? That's where Invincia sits, right? So when an exploit happens, we know it happens because we observed it at that point, and we stop it at that point. Once it gets past that, the internal recon, that's also observable. So it turns out that one action of scanning the network from the inside is very unusual. Most machines have what's called a hub and spoke architecture. So they talk to a server, they don't talk to other machines, right? So that one action of scanning your network will stand out if you're looking for it. Most network defense systems are not looking for it. It's a fairly straightforward thing to do.
Is that changing? Are you
mean, again, if it's not that hard to do, the other question is, are
Yes.
people doing it?
Yeah,
And
so
does
we-
that add cost? Is that something that's hard to do? Doesn't sound like it would be.
No. We our software, which runs on endpoints, will observe that kind of behavior. We'll detect when something starts up. We won't detect if it's quiescent. If it's sitting on disk and it's not running, we don't see anything. Okay. If it starts up and it starts doing stuff, we'll see it and we'll flag it. And we'll see other machines get compromised as well. So there is an opportunity there. It's just, again, traditionally, security products haven't looked on the inside. So it's introspective, and people haven't done that traditionally.
Last question. Is there anything being done on the consumer side? I mean, in terms of products that would be available to consumers that would address that?
No.
I mean, so that, for example, I just want to know, is there something in my PC that shouldn't be there? Is there anything that will help with that? It doesn't sound like there really is at this point.
Well, if you think about what your options are, you've got your Norton Antivirus, you've got your McAfee. They have personal firewalls. You can turn on the personal firewall, which will alert you if something's trying to start up and talk somewhere. Maybe. There's not great consumer tech, is the short answer to your question.
What about the smartphones? Everybody has a smartphone and mostly access their emails and the internet with a smartphone. So can this, these breaches that we're talking about go cross-device with the cloud and everything?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It goes back to the castle and moat approach to security is disintegrating, because we all have mobile devices which are connecting both to our personal accounts as well as to work accounts, right? And this notion of inside and outside perimeter is going away. So, security people are going to have to rethink the model. We have to accept bring your own device. We have to accept that people are inside as you guys are today, but you're also outside when you're home or when you're teleworking or when you're on the road, right? And you need access to your data, whether it's in the cloud or inside the network or on a server somewhere, right? So security really needs to change. And it's just more risk, unfortunately, for most security people, and they're trying to deal with it.
I'd like to thank Dr. Ghosh. Thank you so much, and give him appreciate you coming down. I'd also like to thank Karen Johnson, who did a terrific job helping us organize this. Dr. Ghosh will be here for a couple of minutes if anybody wants to come by and ask any other questions. But thank you so much for the turnout, and I hope you appreciate it as much as I did. I learned a lot about cybersecurity today, so thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all.